Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in wherever you are. Let your body sink a little deeper into comfort, and know that there's nowhere else you need to be right now. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? A quiet room where the day has finally released you. A cozy space where you can let your thoughts slow down. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Tonight we're going to explore one of the most fascinating periods in Japanese history, the Edo period, a span of 265 years when Japan chose something extraordinary. After centuries of civil war, of provinces fighting provinces and warlords battling for supremacy, the island nation closed its doors to almost the entire world and settled into an unprecedented era of peace. We'll discover how this isolation shaped Japanese culture, understand the daily rhythms of life in cities like Edo and Kyoto, and contemplate what it means when a society deliberately steps away from the wider world for more than 2 centuries. It's a journey through floating world theatres and strict social hierarchies, through tea ceremonies and locked gates, through the longest peace any samurai class has ever known. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a dry recitation of dates and political structures. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the lives people actually lived, the art they created, the philosophies they embraced, and the quiet transformation that happened when warriors had no wars to fight. By the end, I think you'll find something both peaceful and profound in this story of chosen isolation and unexpected flourishing. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, a like and subscribe really helps others discover this peaceful way to end their day. And to those of you already subscribed, thank you for being here, for returning to these slow journeys through time. So settle in now, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, and let it out even more slowly. Let's begin our gentle drift through Edo Japan, through 2.5 centuries when the world moved on without them, and they created something remarkable in that quiet space. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to do. Just listen and let the story unfold like a scroll painting, one section at a time. To understand the peace of the Edo period, we need to first understand the war that came before it and how exhausted Japan had become. For more than 100 years, from the late 1400s through the late 1500s, Japan had been locked in what historians call the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. Provincial lords called daimyo commanded private armies, samurai fought for whoever offered the best deal, and alliances shifted like weather. Villages burned, crops were destroyed, and no one could remember a time when peace had lasted more than a season. The country had fragmented into hundreds of competing domains, each one fighting to survive or expand, and the central government in Kyoto had become little more than a ceremonial shell, powerless to stop the endless cycle of violence. Into this chaos came 3 men, one after another, each building on the work of the last. First was Oda Nobunaga, a brilliant and ruthless warlord who began the unification through superior tactics and an early adoption of firearms. He controlled nearly half of Japan before his death in 1582, killed by a betrayal in a temple. Then came Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who rose from peasant origins to complete much of what Nobunaga had started, unifying most of Japan under his control through a combination of military conquest and political marriages. But it was the third man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would create something lasting. Ieyasu was patient in a way the other 2 had not been. He waited, built alliances carefully, and chose his moment. In 1600, at a place called Sekigahara, Ieyasu's forces defeated a coalition of rival daimyo in a battle that lasted a single day but decided the future of Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. The victory was so complete, so decisive, that resistance crumbled. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor in Kyoto granted Ieyasu the title of shogun, military dictator, and with that title came the authority to remake Japan entirely. What Ieyasu understood perhaps better than the men who came before him, was that military victory alone would never create lasting peace. The daimyo needed to be controlled, not just defeated. Their power had to be structured in a way that prevented rebellion while allowing them enough autonomy to maintain their dignity and authority. So Ieyasu created an intricate system of obligations and surveillance, of hostages and required residences, of economic interdependence and political balance. The daimyo were allowed to keep their domains, but their families had to live in Edo, the shogun's new capital, for part of every year. They could maintain armies, but only of specified sizes. They could govern their provinces, but under the watchful eye of Tokugawa inspectors and informants. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the peace began to hold. Samurai who had spent their entire lives preparing for battle found themselves with nothing to fight. Farmers could plant crops with some confidence they would live to harvest them. Merchants could plan for the future instead of just surviving the present. The peace was built on control, yes, on a rigid hierarchy and constant surveillance, but it was peace nonetheless, and after more than a century of war, peace felt like a miracle. This foundation, laid by Ieyasu in those early years of the 1600s, would support an entire civilization's transformation, and it's this remarkable system, with all its complications and contradictions, that leads us naturally to consider what came next. The decision to close Japan to the outside world did not happen all at once, but rather unfolded gradually over several decades in the early 1600s, driven by fear, by a desire for control, and by a particular threat that the Tokugawa shogunate saw lurking in foreign contact. That threat was Christianity. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries had arrived in Japan in the mid-1500s, during the chaos of the Warring States period, and they had been remarkably successful. By the early 1600s, there were perhaps 300,000 Japanese Christians, including some powerful daimyo, and the Tokugawa leadership viewed this with growing alarm. Christianity was dangerous to them not because of its theology, but because of its implications for loyalty and hierarchy. Christians, the shogunate reasoned, owed their ultimate allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope in Rome, and to a god who supposedly superseded earthly authority. This was intolerable in a system built entirely on rigid hierarchies of obligation and loyalty. If samurai could claim a higher authority than their lord, if commoners could appeal to divine law over shogunal decree, the entire structure of Tokugawa control might collapse. And so the persecution began, slowly at first, then with increasing brutality. Christians were forced to renounce their faith by stepping on images of Christ and Mary, a practice called fumie. Those who refused were tortured and executed, sometimes in horrifically public ways designed to terrify others into compliance. But persecution alone was not enough to eliminate the foreign influence. As long as European ships kept arriving, bringing missionaries and ideas along with their trade goods, Christianity could always resurge. And so the Tokugawa shogunate made a choice that would define Japan for the next 220 years. They would cut Japan off from almost all contact with the outside world. Between 1633 and 1639, a series of edicts called the Sakoku, or closed country, laws transformed Japan into one of the most isolated nations on earth. The laws were comprehensive and uncompromising. Japanese people were forbidden to leave the country on pain of death. Those who had left and tried to return were executed. Foreign ships, except for Chinese and Dutch vessels, were banned from Japanese ports. Portuguese and Spanish traders were expelled entirely. The construction of ocean-going ships was prohibited, ensuring that even if someone wanted to leave, they would have no means to do so. Christianity was hunted down with obsessive thoroughness, its practitioners forced underground into hidden communities that would persist in secret for more than 2 centuries. Only one tiny window to the Western world remained open, a fan-shaped artificial island in Nagasaki harbour called Dejima. The Dutch, who had convinced the shogunate that they were interested only in trade, not religious conversion, were permitted to maintain a trading post there. But even this contact was severely restricted. The Dutch traders lived in virtual imprisonment on their tiny island, allowed into the city only on rare occasions and under strict supervision, their every interaction monitored, their books and correspondence censored. Once a year, the head of the Dutch trading post was required to travel to Edo to pay respects to the shogun, a journey of months that served mostly to remind them of their subordinate position. This isolation was not seen as a temporary measure, a brief withdrawal to consolidate power. It was understood from the beginning as a fundamental reorganization of Japan's relationship with the world. Japan would develop on its own terms, without the chaos and contamination of foreign influence, without the threat of colonial conquest that was consuming much of Asia, without the religious complications that had torn Europe apart in wars of reformation and counter-reformation. The country would become an island in more than just the geographic sense, separate, self-contained, and turned inward. And in that inward turning, something unexpected would flourish, a culture of such refinement and creativity that it would astonish the world when Japan's doors finally opened again. Which brings us to the physical manifestation of Tokugawa power, the city they built from almost nothing. When Tokugawa Ieyasu chose Edo as his capital in the late 1500s, it was barely a town, a small fishing village built on marshy land at the edge of a large bay. Kyoto was still the traditional seat of imperial power, and Osaka was the commercial heart of Japan. But Ieyasu wanted something different. He wanted a city built from the ground up according to Tokugawa principles, a city whose very layout would reflect and reinforce the rigid social hierarchies he was creating. And so, starting in 1590, he began one of the most ambitious urban construction projects in Japanese history. The first challenge was the land itself. The area where Edo would rise was wet, prone to flooding, intersected by rivers and streams that made building difficult. But this was also an advantage, because it meant Ieyasu could shape the geography to his purposes. Canals were dug to drain the marshes and to create transportation routes through the growing city. The Kanda River was redirected to provide fresh water. Earth was moved on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire hills were levelled, and the soil used to fill in low-lying areas, creating new land where there had been only water and mud. At the centre of it all, Ieyasu built an enormous castle, the largest castle complex in the world, surrounded by multiple moats and walls, a fortress that announced Tokugawa power to anyone who approached the city. Around this castle, the city grew in concentric circles, each ring representing a different level of society and access to power. Closest to the castle were the residences of the daimyo, the provincial lords who were required to maintain households in Edo as part of the Sankin Kotai system, the alternate attendance system. These were not simple houses, but vast estates with multiple buildings, gardens and housing for hundreds of retainers. Beyond the daimyo residences were the homes of the Hatamoto and Gokenin, the shogun's direct vassals, warriors who owed their positions and incomes directly to the Tokugawa house. And farther out still were the merchant quarters, the artisan neighbourhoods, the entertainment districts, all carefully zoned and controlled. The city grew with astonishing speed. By the early 1700s, barely a century after Ieyasu first arrived, Edo was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population approaching 1 million people. For comparison, London at the same time had perhaps 500,000 residents, Paris even fewer. Edo had become a metropolis, a vast urban sprawl that stretched for miles along the bay, its streets crowded with samurai in formal dress, merchants hauling goods, artisans heading to their workshops, entertainers performing for crowds. The energy of the place must have been extraordinary, all those people drawn together by Tokugawa decree. Living in close quarters, creating an urban culture unlike anything Japan had known before. But this growth brought challenges. Fire was a constant threat in a city built largely of wood and paper, and Edo burned repeatedly throughout its history. The Great Mireki Fire of 1657 killed more than 100,000 people and destroyed more than half the city. After each fire, the city rebuilt, and each rebuilding was an opportunity to improve infrastructure, to widen streets, to create fire breaks. The shogunate developed increasingly sophisticated firefighting organizations, teams of workers who would rush to blazes and create controlled demolitions to stop the spread of flames. Water was another challenge. A city of 1 million people needs enormous amounts of fresh water, and the rivers alone could not supply it. So the shogunate engineered a system of aqueducts and wooden pipes that brought water from the Tama River, miles away, into the heart of the city. Wells were dug throughout the neighbourhoods, and water sellers made their living delivering fresh water to households that lacked direct access. Sewage and waste disposal required constant attention, with night soil collectors making their rounds to gather human waste for sale, to farmers as fertilizer, turning urban pollution into rural productivity. The physical city of Edo, with its vast scale and sophisticated infrastructure, was both a symbol and an instrument of Tokugawa power. It was a city that existed because the shogunate willed it into being, that grew because daimyo were forced to maintain residences there, that functioned because of carefully planned systems of water, fire control and administration. And within this city, within its ordered streets and regulated districts, a society would develop that was as complex and stratified as the city plan itself. Let's turn our attention now to the social structure that governed every aspect of life in Edo, Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate organized Japanese society according to a rigid hierarchy based on an ancient Confucian model, a structure that divided people into 4 classes, each with its designated role, privileges, and limitations. This was not a subtle or flexible system. It was formal, explicit, enforced by law, and reinforced by custom, and it would govern Japanese social relations for the entire Edo period. At the top were the samurai, the warrior class, who made up perhaps 6 or 7% of the population, but held virtually all political and administrative power. Below them were the farmers, who produced the rice that was the foundation of the economy. Then came the artisans, the craftspeople who made the objects and tools necessary for daily life. And at the bottom, paradoxically, were the merchants, the people who handled money and trade but produced nothing themselves. This hierarchy was based on a theory of social value that prized production over profit. Farmers were ranked above merchants because they created food, the fundamental necessity of life, while merchants simply moved goods from one place to another, making money without making things. Artisans ranked above merchants because they transformed raw materials into useful objects through their skill and labour. And samurai ranked above everyone because they, in theory, protected the entire social order through their military prowess and administrative wisdom, though in an age of peace, this military function became increasingly theoretical. The samurai class itself was internally stratified into dozens of ranks, from the shogun at the very top through the daimyo and their senior retainers, down to the lower-ranking foot soldiers who were samurai in name but lived on modest stipends. Each rank came with specific privileges and obligations. Higher-ranking samurai could wear certain colours and fabrics forbidden to those below them, could carry both long and short swords, while lower ranks might carry only one, could ride horses or use palanquins while others had to walk. Even the size of a samurai's residence, the number of rooms, the height of the gate, were all regulated according to rank. For farmers, life was both essential and restricted. They produced the wealth, the rice, that supported the entire system, and they made up perhaps 80% of the population. But they were tied to their land, forbidden to leave their villages without permission, forbidden to wear silk or carry swords, subjected to detailed regulations about what they could grow and how much they could keep versus how much they owed as tax. The standard tax rate was theoretically 40% of the harvest, but in practice it often went higher. Farmers lived simple lives, governed by the rhythms of planting and harvest, by village councils and headmen, by traditions that had persisted for generations. Artisans occupied a curious middle position. They were respected for their skills. The carpenters and metal workers, the weavers and potters, the makers of armour and swords and tea bowls. Some artisan families developed reputations that spanned generations, their work sought after by daimyo and wealthy merchants. They lived in designated neighbourhoods in the cities, often specialising by street, with the sword polishers here and the textile dyers there, the woodblock carvers in one district and the lacquerware makers in another. Their work was essential. But their social status remained below that of farmers because they did not produce food, the ultimate necessity. And then there were the merchants, ranked lowest, but often the wealthiest. The contradiction was obvious to everyone. Merchants grew rich through trade, through lending money to cash-strapped samurai, through controlling the flow of goods between provinces. Great merchant houses like Mitsui, which still exist today, accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the wealth of most daimyo, but officially they remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy, forbidden the trappings of high status, unable to carry swords or wear certain colours, always theoretically subordinate to even the poorest samurai. This created a strange tension that would run throughout the Edo period. Merchants had money but no official status. Samurai had status but often no money. Many lived in genteel poverty, forced to maintain appearances on stipends that never seemed to stretch far enough. And below even the four classes were the outcasts, the ete and hinin, people who worked in occupations considered impure, butchers and tanners, executioners and undertakers, entertainers and beggars. They lived in separate communities, were forbidden from marrying into the four classes, passed their status down through generations with no possibility of escape. This was the social structure that governed daily life, that determined where you could live and what you could wear, who you could marry and what work you could do. It was rigid, often unjust, built on assumptions about inherent worth that trapped people in positions determined by birth. And yet within this rigid structure, culture flourished, art developed. Society found ways to create beauty and meaning even within constraints. Which leads us to perhaps the most interesting paradox of the Edo period. What happens to warriors when there are no wars to fight? The samurai class had defined itself for centuries through warfare, through martial prowess and loyalty unto death, through the code of Bushido that emphasized honor, courage, and absolute commitment to one's lord. Samurai were warriors first and foremost, trained from childhood in swordsmanship and archery, horsemanship and strategy, ready at any moment to fight and die. But the Edo period presented an unprecedented challenge to this identity. For the first time in Japanese history, samurai faced generations of uninterrupted peace. What happens to a warrior class when there are no wars? The answer was a slow, sometimes painful, transformation from warriors into bureaucrats, from fighters into administrators. The shogunate still required samurai to maintain their military skills, to practice with sword and bow, to study tactics and strategy. But these became increasingly ceremonial activities, forms to be mastered rather than skills to be used in actual combat. Instead, samurai found themselves governing provinces, managing finances, adjudicating disputes, maintaining records. They became civil servants, though they still carried two swords and wore their hair in the distinctive topknot that marked their status. This transformation was not entirely comfortable. The samurai identity was so thoroughly bound up with martial valour that many struggled with their new reality. Some turned to scholarship, particularly to Neo-Confucian philosophy, which offered them a new kind of purpose. Instead of protecting society through military might, they would protect it through wise administration, through embodying the Confucian virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and loyalty. The sword became a symbol of moral authority rather than a tool of violence. Others struggled more visibly with the disconnect between their warrior identity and their peaceful reality. There are stories throughout the Edo period of samurai testing their swords on corpses or on condemned criminals, a practice called tamshigiri, as if to prove to themselves that they were still warriors even though they had never fought in a real battle. Some became ronin, masterless samurai, either through the dissolution of their lord's domain or through choice, wandering the country and often falling into poverty or banditry. The 47 ronin, who avenged their lord's forced suicide and became legendary heroes, represented a kind of nostalgic fantasy about what samurai were supposed to be, loyal and brave and willing to die for honour, even though the reality for most samurai was very different. Many samurai also found themselves in financial difficulty. Their income came in the form of stipends, measured in koku of rice, and these stipends were fixed even as the cost of living in cities like Edo rose steadily. A samurai might receive the same 300 koku his grandfather had received, but that amount bought less and less as the decades passed. Meanwhile, merchants grew wealthy through trade, and many samurai found themselves borrowing money from the very people they outranked socially, a humiliating reversal that bred resentment. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, samurai culture achieved a kind of refinement during the Edo period that was remarkable. The tea ceremony, which had been a samurai practice during the Warring States period, became even more formalized and philosophical. The sparse aesthetics of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence, became a central part of samurai culture. Zen Buddhism, which emphasized meditation and sudden enlightenment, attracted many samurai seeking meaning beyond their bureaucratic duties. The arts of flower arrangement and calligraphy, of garden design and poetry, were all pursued seriously by samurai who saw in these refined practices a way to express the discipline and focus that had once been reserved for warfare. In a sense, the Edo period samurai created a new kind of warrior culture, one based not on actual fighting but on the constant cultivation of readiness, on the maintenance of standards and forms and hierarchies that kept alive the possibility of warfare even in its absence. They practiced with swords they would never use in battle, maintained armour that would never be worn in war, studied tactics that would never be employed. And in this transformation from warriors to bureaucrats, from soldiers to scholars and aesthetes, they created much of what we now think of as traditional Japanese culture, the careful attention to form, the appreciation for restraint and subtlety, the cultivation of skills to levels of extraordinary refinement. And this culture of refinement would spread beyond the samurai class, influencing the entire society in ways both profound and unexpected, which is where our journey continues as we move into the second act of our exploration. The economy of Edo Japan rested on two foundations, rice and the roads that connected the country's disparate provinces into a functioning system of exchange and control. Rice was not just food, it was currency, the measure of wealth, the medium of exchange, the basis of taxation. A daimyo's power was measured in koku, each koku representing roughly enough rice to feed one person for 1 year, about 5 bushels. A domain might be rated at 50,000 koku or 300,000 koku, numbers that indicated not just agricultural production, but military and political power. Samurai received their stipends in koku, though by the Edo period these were usually converted to cash payments based on the current price of rice. This rice-based economy created some peculiar dynamics. Because samurai and daimyo were paid in rice, they needed to convert it to money to buy goods and services in the cities. This conversion was handled by rice brokers and merchants, who bought rice at set rates and sold it at market prices, making profits on the spread. Some of these merchants became enormously wealthy, none more so than the great rice traders of Osaka, which had become the country's commercial capital. The Dojima Rice Exchange in Osaka, established in the late 1600s, was one of the world's first futures markets, where traders bought and sold rice contracts for delivery at future dates, speculating on price movements months in advance. But rice alone could not sustain an economy, that was becoming increasingly complex and urbanized. Edo needed goods from across Japan, silk from the north, sack from Kyoto, pottery from Kyushu, dried fish from the coast, and these goods needed to move along roads that were carefully controlled by the shogunate. The most important of these was the Tokaido, the Eastern Sea Road, which connected Edo with Kyoto along the Pacific coast, passing through 53 stations where travellers could rest, change horses, and resupply. The journey took about 2 weeks on foot, and it was one of the most travelled routes in the world, constantly busy with daimyo processions heading to and from Edo for their required alternating residence, with merchants transporting goods, with pilgrims visiting shrines, with messengers carrying urgent communications. The shogunate regulated these roads meticulously as a matter of security. Bridges were deliberately not built over major rivers, forcing travellers to use ferries or fords that could be controlled. Sekisho, barrier stations, were established at strategic points where travellers had to show permits and could be searched for contraband or for women trying to leave Edo without permission, since the wives and children of daimyo were essentially hostages to ensure their husbands' loyalty. No wheeled vehicles were allowed on the main roads. A restriction that seems bizarre until you realise it was designed to slow the movement of armies and make rebellion more difficult to organise. This created an economy that was simultaneously highly developed and deliberately constrained. Trade flourished, but within strict limits. Merchants created sophisticated credit instruments and accounting systems, but they could not use them to challenge the political order. Cities grew and prospered, but the shogunate could always control the flow of goods and people through its regulation of roads and ports. It was an economy designed for stability rather than growth, for maintaining the existing order rather than encouraging innovation. And yet growth happened anyway, not through industrial revolution or technological advancement, but through the steady accumulation of small improvements and the development of highly specialized regional industries. Each domain was encouraged to develop special products, monopolies that could be traded for other necessities. Satsuma in southern Kyushu had sugar, Kaga had silk. Various regions became known for their particular styles of pottery or lacquerware or sake. This created a complex network of regional exchange that enriched the merchant class, even as it was supposed to keep them subordinate. The shogunate's response to merchant wealth was typically conservative, occasional sumptuary laws that restricted what merchants could wear or how they could display their wealth. Periodic wealth confiscations or forced loans that reminded merchants of their place in the hierarchy. But these measures were temporary annoyances at best, ineffective at controlling an economic transformation that was happening despite official disapproval. Merchants simply became more discreet, wearing plain outer garments over expensive silk linings, building townhouses that looked modest from the street but concealed luxurious interiors. Wealth found ways to express itself even within constraints, and this merchant wealth, accumulating in cities like Edo and Osaka, would fund a cultural explosion that transformed Japanese art and entertainment, beginning with a district that existed officially as a necessary evil but became the creative heart of urban culture. The term floating world, or ukiyo, originally carried Buddhist connotations of the transient sorrowful nature of earthly existence, the suffering world we must endure before enlightenment. But during the Edo period, this term was cleverly repurposed to describe something very different: the licensed pleasure quarters, where people went to escape the rigid hierarchies and obligations of daily life, to float free for a few hours in a world where status mattered less than money, where pleasure was openly pursued rather than dutifully suppressed. The largest and most famous of these districts was the Yoshiwara in Edo, a walled compound on the northern edge of the city where prostitution, officially banned everywhere else, was not only permitted but carefully regulated. The Yoshiwara was established in the early 1600s as part of the shogunate's attempt to control urban vice by containing it, concentrating all the courtesans, entertainers and pleasure houses in one location where they could be monitored, taxed, and kept separate from respectable society. It was surrounded by a moat and walls with a single guarded entrance, and in theory, no one could enter or leave without passing through this checkpoint. In practice, it became one of the most vibrant cultural centres in all of Japan, a place where art and literature flourished, where fashion trends began, where the rigid social hierarchies of the outside world were at least temporarily suspended. The Yoshiwara was organised according to its own strict hierarchy, one based on beauty, wit, and accomplishment rather than birth. At the top were the Taiyu and Oiran, the highest-ranking courtesans, women who were accomplished in music, poetry, calligraphy, and conversation, whose fees were so expensive that only wealthy merchants or high-ranking samurai could afford their company. These women were celebrities, trendsetters whose hairstyles and clothing would be copied throughout the city. They moved through the district in elaborate processions, wearing layered kimonos so heavy they needed assistants to help them walk, their hair decorated with dozens of ornate pins. Their wooden platform shoes making them tower above the crowd. Below the Oiran were the various ranks of ordinary courtesans, women who entertained less wealthy clients in smaller houses, their status carefully marked by subtle differences in dress and behaviour that everyone in the floating world understood. And below even these were the bathhouse girls and the lowest-ranking prostitutes who worked in the back streets at the edges of the district. It was a brutal hierarchy, and the lives of many of these women were tragic, sold by impoverished families or trapped by debt, working in an industry that consumed them and discarded them when their beauty faded. But the Yoshiwara was more than just a centre of prostitution. It was also where much of Edo's artistic innovation happened. Kabuki actors, who were officially classed as outcasts and forbidden from most respectable entertainment, performed in the district and drew enormous crowds. Ukiyo-e woodblock print artists found their subject matter in the courtesans and actors of the floating world, creating images that captured the energy and aesthetic of this urban demi-monde. Poets and writers gathered in the tea houses, composing verses that celebrated fleeting beauty and transient pleasures. The merchant class, with money but no official status, could come to the Yoshiwara and be treated as important, could compete for the attention of famous courtesans, could enjoy luxuries forbidden to them in the rigid world outside. There was something genuinely subversive about the floating world, a space where the official values of Confucian hierarchy and samurai stoicism were openly flouted in favour of pleasure and display. A wealthy merchant in the Yoshiwara was more important than a poor samurai. Money trumped birth, and aesthetic sensibility mattered more than official rank. The shogunate tolerated this because it was contained, walled off, taxed, and because it provided a release valve for social tensions that might otherwise have become dangerous. People could transgress for a night and then return to their proper places in the morning. The aesthetics developed in the floating world, the appreciation for fleeting beauty, the celebration of the moment, the cultivation of style and wit, influenced the broader culture in ways the shogunate probably did not intend. The idea that life should be enjoyed, that pleasure was worth pursuing, that beauty could be found in temporary imperfect things, these were not the values of official Confucianism, with its emphasis on duty and hierarchy. But they became deeply embedded in Edo culture, part of what made the period distinctive and creative. And this creativity found its most enduring expression in an art form that began as popular entertainment, but became one of Japan's greatest contributions to world art: the woodblock prints that captured the floating world in ink and colour. Ukiyo-e Pictures of the Floating World began as a commercial art form. Affordable prints sold to ordinary townspeople who wanted images of beautiful courtesans or famous kabuki actors to decorate their homes. This was not high art in the traditional sense, not the ink landscape paintings that samurai collected or the Buddhist sculptures that temples commissioned. This was popular culture, mass-produced images created through a collaborative process involving artists, woodblock carvers, printers, and publishers. each contributing their specialized skills to create prints that could be sold for roughly the price of a bowl of noodles. The process of creating a woodblock print was intricate and required extraordinary precision. First, the artist would create a design in ink on thin paper. This design was then glued face down onto a block of cherry wood, and a carver would cut away everything except the lines of the design, creating a relief block. For a multicolour print, separate blocks were carved for each colour, and these had to align perfectly, or the final image would be blurred and useless. The printer would then ink each block and press it onto paper in sequence, building up layers of colour to create the final image. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of copies could be made from a single set of blocks before they wore out. The early ukiyo-e artists focused on the inhabitants of the floating world, creating portraits of courtesans that emphasized their elaborate clothing and hairstyles, their elegant gestures and serene expressions. These were not realistic portraits, but idealized images, the women depicted according to aesthetic conventions that prized long necks and small hands, pale oval faces and carefully composed postures. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaro, working in the late 1700s, created images of women that were so beautiful, so perfectly composed. They became the standard against which real beauty was measured. Kabuki actors were another major subject, theatrical prints that captured dramatic moments from popular plays or showed actors in their most famous roles. These prints often included the actors' crests and stage names, and fans collected them much as modern fans might collect posters of movie stars. Some actors became so famous through these prints that their faces were recognizable throughout Japan, and a positive review in print form could make or break a career. The relationship between the theatre and the print trade was symbiotic, each promoting the other, creating a cycle of fame and commercial success. But ukiyo-e evolved beyond portraits of the floating world. In the early 1800s, artists began to create landscape prints, images of famous places and scenic views that captured the beauty of Japan's mountains and coast. Katsushika Hokusai, one of the greatest of all ukiyo-e artists, created his series Quote One in the 1830s, including the iconic image of the Great Wave with Fuji in the background, print that has become one of the most recognized images in world art. Hokusai was obsessed with capturing the essence of natural forms, with understanding how water moved and how mountains stood, with showing the relationship between human activity and the natural world. His contemporary, Utagawa Hiroshige, created landscapes of extraordinary subtlety and mood. His series _Quote_2_ showing scenes from the Great Road connecting Edo and Kyoto. Hiroshige's prints captured specific weather conditions, rain falling on a bridge, snow settling on a village, mist rising from a river at dawn. He understood how to use colour and composition to create emotional resonance, his prints evoking nostalgia, peace, melancholy, the complex feelings of travel and passage through landscapes that were both beautiful and transient. These landscape prints were hugely popular, and they created a new way of seeing Japan, a kind of visual tourism where people could experience famous places through art, even if they could never travel there themselves. The prints were collected in albums, studied by artists learning composition, displayed in homes and tea houses. And when Japan's doors finally opened in the mid-1800s, and these prints reached Europe, they had an enormous impact on Western art, influencing the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists with their bold compositions, flat areas of colour, and unusual perspectives. Ukiyo-e represents a remarkable example of how popular culture can achieve greatness. How art created for commercial purposes and ordinary audiences can transcend its origins to become timeless. These prints were never meant to last for centuries. They were printed on cheap paper with fugitive colours, designed to be enjoyed for a season, and then discarded. That they survived, that they influenced art across the world, that we still find them beautiful today, speaks to something essential about the creativity of the Edo period. And this creativity extended beyond visual art into performance, into a theatrical form that was as bold and energetic as ukiyo-e was delicate and refined. Kabuki theatre began in the early 1600s as a kind of scandalous street entertainment, supposedly invented by a shrine maiden named Okuni, who performed dances in the dry riverbed of Kyoto's Kamo River. These early performances were provocative and sexual, performed by women who were often also prostitutes, attracting crowds that the authorities viewed with suspicion. By 1629, the shogunate had banned women from performing kabuki entirely, concerned about the disorder and moral corruption they supposedly encouraged. But banning women did not kill kabuki, it simply transformed it. Young men took over the female roles, and kabuki became an all-male theatrical form where the onagata, specialists in female roles, achieved extraordinary skill in embodying femininity through stylized movement and speech. The best onagata were considered more graceful, more truly feminine than actual women. Their performances distilled ideals of female beauty and behaviour into pure theatrical art. These actors trained from childhood to move in the small steps and soft gestures appropriate to women's roles, to speak in higher registers, to express emotion through subtle changes in posture and expression. They often maintained their feminine personas off stage as well, living as women in their daily lives to perfect their craft. Kabuki developed its own highly distinctive aesthetic, characterized by dramatic poses called mii, where actors would freeze at climactic moments. Their faces contorted in exaggerated expressions, while wooden clappers provided rhythmic punctuation. Makeup was stylized and symbolic, white base with red and black lines indicating character type and temperament. Costumes were elaborate and often impossibly heavy, layers of silk that transformed actors into walking works of art. The stage incorporated mechanical elements, trapdoors for sudden entrances, a revolving stage for rapid scene changes. A hanamichi or flower path extending through the audience so actors could make dramatic entrances and exits right through the crowd. The plays themselves range from historical dramas to domestic tragedies, to dance pieces that showcased actors' physical skills. Historical plays often featured samurai and nobility, tales of loyalty and revenge that resonated with contemporary concerns about duty and honour, even when set in earlier periods. Domestic plays dealt with the lives of merchants and ordinary townspeople, their forbidden loves and financial troubles, their conflicts between duty and desire. These seiwamono, contemporary life plays, could be remarkably frank about social problems, showing the dark side of the rigid class system, the cruelty of arranged marriages, the desperation of people trapped by debt or social obligation. Audiences for kabuki were rowdy and engaged, eating and drinking during performances, shouting approval of favourite actors, hissing at villains. The theatre was a social space as much as an aesthetic one, a place to see and be seen, to meet friends and discuss the latest gossip, to immerse oneself for hours in stories that were both escapist and culturally relevant. Different sections of the theatre were priced for different classes, with the most expensive boxes for wealthy merchants and middle-ranking samurai, cheaper seating in the upper galleries for artisans and shopkeepers, standing room for the poorer spectators. Star actors became celebrities whose personal lives were followed as avidly as their performances, their love affairs and rivalries providing fodder for gossip and speculation. Theatrical families passed down specialized roles and techniques through generations, with famous names like Ichikawa and Nakamura commanding enormous prestige and earning substantial incomes. Some actors were so popular that their performances could cause near riots, crowds fighting for tickets or trying to force their way into sold-out shows. The shogunate viewed kabuki with deep ambivalence. It was morally suspect, associated with the floating world and its transgressions. It could be subversive, its plots sometimes containing veiled criticisms of contemporary politics. But it was also enormously popular, providing entertainment to hundreds of thousands of people and generating substantial tax revenue. So the authorities regulated it instead of banning it completely, confining theatres to specific districts, censoring plays that were too explicitly critical of the government, occasionally punishing actors who overstepped acceptable bounds. And through all these regulations and restrictions, kabuki thrived, becoming an integral part of urban culture, influencing fashion and language, providing material for ukiyo-e prints and popular novels, creating a shared cultural vocabulary that crossed class lines. The dramatic gestures and exaggerated emotions of kabuki seeped into everyday life, people striking poses or using theatrical phrases in their daily interactions. It was theatre that was deeply embedded in its culture, not separate from ordinary life but part of it, reflecting and shaping the urban world of Edo Japan. And alongside this bold, dramatic art form, the period also cultivated practices of extraordinary restraint and refinement, beginning with a ceremony that transformed the simple act of drinking tea into a profound meditation on presence and beauty. The tea ceremony, or chanoyu, had been practiced in Japan for centuries before the Edo period, but it was during these 265 years of peace that it achieved its most refined form, becoming not just a way of preparing and drinking tea, but an entire philosophy of aesthetics and behaviour, a practice that embodied everything the floating world was not. Where kabuki was loud and dramatic, the tea ceremony was quiet and restrained. Where the pleasure quarters celebrated abundance and display, the tea room valued simplicity and subtle beauty. Where ukiyo-e captured passing moments, the tea ceremony created timeless ones. The ceremony took place in small, deliberately humble structures, often separate buildings and gardens designed to provide a transition from the busy world to the meditative space of tea. These tea houses were tiny, usually just 4.5 tatami mats, barely large enough for the host and a few guests. You entered through a small door that required bowing, a gesture that forced humility regardless of social rank, the idea being that everyone who entered the tea room was equal in that space. Inside, the decoration was minimal, a scroll hanging in the alcove, a single flower arrangement, nothing to distract from the essential act of making and drinking tea together. The founder of the philosophy that governed Edo period tea ceremony was Sen no Rikyu, who lived in the late 1500s but whose influence extended throughout the Edo period. Rikyu established the principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility as the foundation of tea practice. Every movement in the ceremony was prescribed: the way the host cleaned the tea utensils, the specific angle of the tea scoop, the number of whisks used to blend the powdered tea and hot water into a frothy liquid. These movements were not arbitrary, but were designed to focus attention, to create a shared rhythm between host and guests, to transform a simple act into a meditation. The objects used in tea ceremony were carefully chosen for their aesthetic qualities, but these qualities were not conventional beauty. Rikyu championed wabi-sabi, an aesthetic that found beauty in imperfection, asymmetry, roughness, and age. A tea bowl might be deliberately misshapen, its glaze uneven, its surface marked by cracks that had been repaired with gold. The technique called kintsugi that honoured the object's history rather than trying to hide its damage. This was a direct rejection of the smooth perfection prized in Chinese ceramics, a distinctively Japanese aesthetic that valued character over flawlessness. During the Edo period, the tea ceremony became an essential part of samurai culture, a practice that allowed warriors to cultivate inner stillness and aesthetic sensitivity while maintaining their martial identity. The concentration required to perform the ceremony correctly, the mindfulness needed to be fully present with each movement, these were seen as compatible with and even necessary for the warrior's path. Many daimyo were serious tea practitioners, building tea houses in their estates, collecting tea utensils, studying with acknowledged masters. But tea was not restricted to the samurai class. Wealthy merchants also practiced tea ceremony, finding in it a kind of cultural capital that money alone could not buy. A merchant might be officially ranked below a poor samurai in the social hierarchy, but if he was an accomplished tea master with refined taste in tea utensils, he commanded a kind of respect that transcended class boundaries. The tea room became one of the few spaces where social hierarchy was genuinely suspended, where a merchant could host a daimyo and both would participate as equals in the shared practice. Different schools of tea ceremony developed during the Edo period, each preserving slightly different interpretations of Rikyu's teachings. The three main schools, all descended from Rikyu's family, were the Omoto Senke, Ura Senke, and Mushakoji Senke, and they competed for students and prestige while maintaining the essential elements of the practice. Learning tea ceremony could take years, even decades, students progressing through ranks as they mastered increasingly complex procedures and deeper philosophical understanding. The philosophy of tea extended beyond the ceremony itself to influence broader Japanese aesthetics. The appreciation for simplicity, for natural materials, for objects that showed their age and use, for spaces that invited contemplation rather than display, these all became central to Japanese design and architecture. The tea ceremony taught people to pay attention, to notice the subtle qualities of light on water, the sound of the kettle heating, the texture of a bamboo scoop, the fleeting beauty of a single flower. It cultivated an awareness of the present moment that was both aesthetic and spiritual. And in cultivating this awareness, in perfecting this stillness, the tea ceremony offered something profound to Edo period culture, a counterbalance to the bustle of city life, a practice that honoured slowness and attention in a world that was becoming increasingly commercial and fast-paced. It was a reminder that not everything worth doing needed to be productive, that there was value in practices whose only purpose was presence and beauty. This philosophy of finding depth in simplicity would extend into other art forms as well, particularly into a poetic practice that captured entire worlds in just 17 syllables, which is where our journey leads us next as we enter the third act of our exploration. The haiku, that brief form of poetry that captures a moment in just 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables, achieved its definitive form during the Edo period through the work of poets who understood that brevity could contain infinite depth, that a handful of carefully chosen words could evoke entire worlds of feeling and meaning. This was poetry stripped to its essence, poetry that trusted the reader to complete the image, to feel the resonance beneath the surface of the words. In a culture that valued restraint and subtlety, that appreciated the space between things as much as the things themselves, haiku became the perfect poetic expression. The master who elevated haiku from a parlour game to a serious art form was Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694, travelling throughout Japan and creating poems that combined keen observation of nature with profound spiritual insight. Basho's most famous haiku captures a single moment with such precision that it has echoed through centuries. An old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. In Japanese, this is even more economical. Just 17 syllables that contain silence and sound, stillness and movement, the eternal and the instantaneous. The poem works through what it doesn't say as much as what it does. The listener imagines the stillness before the splash, the ripples spreading, the silence returning. Basho taught that haiku should capture the essence of a moment without explaining or elaborating, should present an image that resonates with deeper meaning without stating that meaning directly. He called this quality karumi, lightness, a kind of effortless depth that came from perfect simplicity. His poems often juxtapose natural observation with human emotion, creating that flash of recognition, that moment of connection, that the Japanese called aware, a gentle sadness at the transience of beautiful things. A haiku might describe falling blossoms or autumn wind or winter rain, but beneath the surface image was always an awareness of passing time, of beauty's impermanence, of the poignant nature of existence itself. Other poets followed Basho's path while developing their own distinctive voices. Yosabuson, painting poet of the mid-1800s, created haiku that were more visual, more colourful. his background as a painter evident in his ability to capture scenes with precise sensory detail. His poems often had a kind of warmth and humour that Basho's more austere work sometimes lacked. And then there was Kobayashi Isa, who wrote from the perspective of the poor and marginalised. His haiku often featuring insects and small creatures observed with tenderness and identification. A flea on a moonlit night, a cicada singing not knowing it would soon die, a snail climbing Mount Fuji slowly, slowly. The practice of haiku became widespread during the Edo period. Not just among professional poets, but among ordinary people who gathered in poetry circles to compose linked verses, where one person would write the opening 3 lines and another would respond with 2 lines, creating chains of images and associations that could extend for dozens of verses. These gatherings were social and competitive, participants trying to outdo each other with clever wordplay and unexpected images, but they were also meditative, requiring attention to seasonal references and to the subtle rules that governed which images could follow which. Haiku had strict conventions that poets learned through years of study. Each poem had to include a quote 5, a seasonal word that anchored the poem in a specific time of year: snow for winter, cherry blossoms for spring, cicadas for summer, falling leaves for autumn. These seasonal references connected the individual moment to the larger cycles of nature, reminded readers that their own experiences were part of patterns that had repeated for millennia. The poems also often included a quote 6, a cutting word that created a pause or shift in the poem, a moment of breath that allowed the meaning to deepen. What made haiku particularly suited to the Edo period was its democracy. Unlike more elaborate poetic forms that required extensive education and knowledge of Chinese classics, haiku could be practiced by anyone who paid attention to the world around them, who could capture a moment of genuine observation in simple words. Farmers and merchants, samurai and priests, all could write haiku, and in that shared practice they created a common language of attention and appreciation. The form taught people to notice, to value the small and overlooked, to find significance in ordinary moments. A crow on a bare branch, snow falling into a river, the sound of temple bells at dusk. These simple observations became doorways into deeper contemplation of time, change, existence, and beauty. And this attention to the natural world, this practice of noticing and appreciating what was right in front of you, connected to broader currents in Edo period thought and culture, even as Japan remained isolated from most of the world. Which leads us to consider that single small window that remained open to Western knowledge. On a tiny fan-shaped artificial island in Nagasaki Harbour, barely 200 metres long and 80 metres wide, connected to the mainland by a single guarded bridge, a handful of Dutch traders lived in what amounted to gilded imprisonment, the sole official Western presence in all of Japan for more than 200 years. This was Dejima, the narrow window through which trickled the only direct contact between Edo Japan and the European world, a strange arrangement that satisfied the shogunate's need to control foreign influence, while maintaining access to foreign goods and knowledge. The Dutch had been granted this privilege because they had convinced the Tokugawa shogunate that they were different from the Portuguese and Spanish, that they cared only for trade, not for religious conversion. When the shogunate demanded that the Dutch prove their loyalty by helping suppress the Christian Shimabara rebellion in 1637 and 1638, the Dutch complied, using their ships' cannons to bombard the Christian rebels, demonstrating that profit mattered more to them than religious solidarity. This ruthless pragmatism earned them the right to remain after all other Europeans were expelled. Life on Dejima was peculiar and constrained in ways that must have felt surreal to the Dutch traders who lived there. They were forbidden from leaving the island except on rare occasions and under heavy guard. Japanese women were allowed to visit but could not stay overnight, ensuring that no permanent European presence developed. All their correspondence was censored, their books examined for Christian content, their every action monitored by Japanese officials who lived on the island with them. They could not trade directly with Japanese merchants, but had to work through designated intermediaries who controlled prices and availability. Yet despite these restrictions, Dejima became remarkably important as a conduit for knowledge and goods. European books on medicine, astronomy, geography, and military technology entered Japan through Dejima, creating the foundation for a school of learning called Rangaku, Dutch learning, that would become increasingly important as the Edo period progressed. Japanese interpreters stationed at Dejima learned Dutch and translated these books, gradually building a body of Western scientific knowledge that existed in tension with the official policy of isolation. The goods that flowed through Dejima were diverse and sometimes surprising. The Dutch brought Southeast Asian spices, Indian textiles, European glassware, clocks, telescopes, medical instruments. Japan exported silver, copper, ceramics, lacquerware, all carefully regulated to prevent the depletion of precious metals that could destabilize the economy. The trade was profitable for both sides. The Dutch made substantial profits that justified the humiliating conditions, and the shogunate gained access to foreign goods while maintaining tight control over foreign influence. Once a year, the head of the Dutch trading post was required to make the long journey from Nagasaki to Edo to pay respects to the shogun. A journey that took months and was carefully choreographed to demonstrate Dutch subordination to Japanese authority. The Dutch delegation would travel in a formal procession, staying at designated inns, observed by curious crowds who had never seen Europeans before. In Edo, they would perform the ritual kowtow before the shogun, present gifts, answer questions about conditions in Europe, and generally play the role of exotic tributaries acknowledging Japanese superiority. These journeys, as humiliating as they were intended to be, also served an important function for both sides. The Dutch could gather information about Japan, observe conditions in different provinces, make contacts that might prove useful for trade, and the Japanese could learn about the outside world. The interpreters and officials who accompanied the Dutch would later write reports about what they had seen and heard, contributing to a growing awareness that the world beyond Japan's shores was changing in ways that might eventually matter. The physicians attached to the Dutch trading post were particularly important sources of knowledge. Western medicine, with its emphasis on anatomy and surgery, offered techniques that traditional Chinese medicine did not, and some Japanese doctors were eager to learn. A German physician named Engelbert Kaempfer, who served at Dejima in the early 1690s, wrote detailed observations of Japan that would later be published in Europe, providing one of the first comprehensive accounts of the country. Later physicians would teach anatomy and surgical techniques to Japanese students, contributing to a medical knowledge base that blended Eastern and Western approaches. Dejima represented a kind of compromise, a way for Japan to maintain its isolation while acknowledging that complete separation from the world was neither possible nor entirely desirable. It was a controlled opening, carefully managed, never allowed to threaten the fundamental policy of Sakoku. But it was also a reminder that isolation was a choice that required constant maintenance, that the world outside existed and continued to develop, whether Japan paid attention or not. And through this narrow Dutch window, knowledge seeped in, creating currents of curiosity and learning that would gradually undermine the very isolation the system was designed to preserve. Which brings us to the school of thought that developed around this imported knowledge. Rangaku, the study of Western learning through Dutch books and contacts, began as a marginal curiosity pursued by a handful of physicians and interpreters. But over the course of the Edo period, it would grow into a significant intellectual movement that challenged traditional assumptions and laid the groundwork for Japan's eventual modernization. This was knowledge pursued against considerable obstacles, learning a difficult foreign language from limited resources, studying subjects that had no place in the Confucian curriculum that dominated official education, sometimes risking official displeasure by appearing too interested in things foreign and potentially subversive. The foundation of Rangaku was language. To learn from Western books, Japanese scholars first had to learn Dutch, a language completely unrelated to Japanese, with different grammar, different sounds, different conceptual structures. The earlier students had no dictionaries, no textbooks, only the knowledge they could extract from Dutch traders and interpreters at Dejima, who were often not particularly interested in teaching. But slowly, painfully, a core group of scholars built up proficiency, created word lists, compiled dictionaries, until Dutch became a language that Japanese intellectuals could read and study. One of the most important early Rangaku scholars was Sugita Genpaku, a physician who in 1771 witnessed a dissection of a criminal's corpse and realized that the Dutch anatomy text he possessed, a translation of a German work, was far more accurate than traditional Chinese medical texts about the internal structure of the human body. This was a shocking discovery. The idea that cherished traditional knowledge could be wrong, while foreign books were right, challenged fundamental assumptions about the superiority of Eastern learning. Sugita convinced several colleagues to collaborate on translating the anatomy text into Japanese, a project that took years and resulted in Kaitai Shinsho, New Book of Anatomy, published in 1774. This translation was revolutionary not just for its content but for what it represented, a willingness to admit that the West had knowledge worth learning, that traditional texts could be wrong, that empirical observation should trump inherited wisdom. The book included detailed illustrations of organs and systems, labelled in Japanese, making Western anatomical knowledge accessible to physicians throughout Japan. It sparked interest in Western medicine and encouraged other translation projects, creating momentum for Rangaku study. The scope of Rangaku gradually expanded beyond medicine to include astronomy, geography, military technology, chemistry, physics, and other fields. Scholars studied Western books on artillery and fortifications, trying to understand the military technologies that had made European powers dominant in much of the world. They examined Western maps and globes, learning about continents and oceans that traditional Japanese geography barely acknowledged. They investigated Western astronomy, with its heliocentric model of the solar system and precise mathematical predictions of planetary positions, knowledge that challenged both traditional Chinese astronomy and Buddhist cosmology. Some daimyo, particularly those whose domains faced potential threats from foreign ships, actively encouraged Rangaku study, seeing it as necessary for defense. The domain of Saga invested heavily in Western military technology, building one of Japan's first reverberatory furnaces for casting cannons based on Dutch technical manuals. Other domains established schools where samurai could study Western subjects alongside traditional martial arts and Confucian classics. This created a curious situation where officially forbidden knowledge was being actively promoted by parts of the government for practical reasons. The shogunate's attitude toward Rangaku was ambivalent and shifted over time. Initially, Western learning was tolerated as a necessary evil, useful for medicine and defense, but potentially dangerous if it led to questioning of fundamental social and political structures. Some Rangaku scholars were punished when their studies seemed to threaten orthodoxy, particularly those who showed too much interest in Christianity or who criticized the policy of isolation. But the shogunate also recognized that Western knowledge could be useful, establishing the Bansho Shirabeisho, an institute for the study and translation of Western books, in 1856 as foreign pressure on Japan intensified. What's fascinating about Rangaku is how it created a community of scholars who were simultaneously part of the Edo system and subtly subversive of it. They were often samurai or physicians with official positions, but their studies led them to question received wisdom and to imagine alternatives to the way things were. They developed a taste for empirical observation over textual authority, for testing ideas through experiment rather than accepting them on the basis of ancient texts. Attitudes that were fundamentally at odds with Confucian learning, that prized mastery of classical texts and respect for tradition. By the time Commodore Perry's ships arrived in 1853, Japan had a cadre of intellectuals who understood Western technology and political systems, who could read European languages, who knew that Japan was falling behind in military power and industrial development. And this knowledge, accumulated over decades of patient Rangaku study, would prove crucial in Japan's rapid modernization after the Edo period ended. But that story comes later, and for now we turn our attention to another aspect of Edo period culture, the refinement of craft to levels of extraordinary beauty and precision. The Edo period saw Japanese crafts reach levels of refinement and technical excellence that have rarely been matched anywhere in the world. A development made possible by the long peace that allowed artisan families to pass down skills through multiple generations, by the urban markets that supported specialized production, and by a culture that valued mastery and perfection in even the most humble objects. These were not artists in the modern sense creating unique works for individual patrons, but craftspeople creating functional objects, bowls and boxes, swords and tools, textiles and ceramics. Yet they approached their work with such dedication and skill that functionality and beauty became inseparable. Ceramics offer perhaps the clearest example of how craft became art during the Edo period. Different regions developed distinctive styles of pottery, each with its own techniques, glazes, and aesthetic preferences. Arita and Kyushu became famous for porcelain, including the blue and white wares called imari, and the colourful overglaze enamelled pieces called kakiemon, both of which were exported to Europe through the Dutch and became enormously influential on European ceramic development. Besenware from Okayama was deliberately unglazed, fired in wood-burning kilns for days, until natural ash deposits created subtle colour variations on the surface, each piece unique, valued for the random beauty created by fire and ash. The tea ceremony drove demand for certain kinds of ceramics, particularly for tea bowls that embodied wabi-sabi aesthetics. Bowls that were rough-textured, irregular, marked by chance effects of firing, deliberately imperfect in ways that revealed their handmade origins and connected them to natural processes. A great tea bowl from a respected kiln could become a treasured heirloom, passed down through generations, accumulating significance and value with age and use. Some ceramic families developed such reputations that their work commanded extraordinary prices, and the title of head of the family kiln was passed from father to son with ceremonies that acknowledged the weight of inherited tradition and responsibility. Textile production also achieved remarkable sophistication. Kyoto was the centre of silk weaving, producing complex brocades and elaborate embroideries for formal kimonos worn by the wealthy. The dyeing techniques called yuzen allowed for incredibly detailed pictorial designs on silk, with multiple colours applied through resist-dyeing processes that required extraordinary patience and precision. A single high-quality kimono might take months to produce and involve the work of multiple specialised craftspeople: the silk reeler, the weaver, the dyer, the embroiderer, each contributing their expertise to create a garment that was both functional clothing and wearable art. Lacquerware reached pinnacles of refinement, with craftspeople in different regions specializing in different techniques. Lacquer is made from the sap of the urushi tree, applied in thin layers and polished between coats, a process that can take months for high-quality pieces. Some lacquerware was inlaid with shell or precious metals, creating designs that glowed with subtle iridescence. Others were sprinkled with gold or silver powder while the lacquer was still wet, creating macchia designs of landscapes and flowers that seemed to float in depth within the glossy black or red surface. The finest lacquerware was exported to Europe, where it was prized by collectors and influenced European decorative arts. Metalwork also achieved extraordinary levels of skill, particularly in sword making and in the small metal fittings called netsuke and tsuba. Swordsmiths, though their military function had largely disappeared in the peaceful Edo period, continued to forge blades using techniques that had been refined over centuries, folding steel thousands of times to create layered metal of great strength and beauty, tempering the edge to perfect hardness while leaving the spine flexible, polishing the blade until it revealed the subtle grain patterns called Haida and the temper line called Heiman, each blade unique, each a testament to the smith's mastery. These swords were status symbols for samurai, but they were also appreciated as art objects, as physical embodiments of the values of discipline, precision, and dedication to perfection. What's striking about Edo period craft is how it embodied a particular philosophy about the relationship between maker and object, between technique and beauty, between tradition and individual expression. Craftspeople were expected to master their tradition completely, to learn every technique their predecessors had developed, to be able to reproduce classic forms perfectly. Only after years of such training, of complete internalization of traditional methods, were they permitted to innovate, to add their own interpretations, to create variations that honored the tradition while extending it. This meant that innovation was always grounded in deep knowledge, that new developments grew organically from old roots, creating continuity even in change. The dedication required to achieve mastery in any craft was extraordinary, often a lifetime commitment that began in childhood. An apprentice might spend years doing the most basic tasks, preparing materials, cleaning tools, observing the masterwork before being allowed to attempt actual production. The path to becoming a recognized craftsperson was long and demanding, but those who achieved it became part of a lineage, keepers of knowledge and skill that connected them to centuries of makers who had worked before them, and to generations who would come after. And this dedication to mastery extended beyond individual crafts to the design and cultivation of spaces, particularly in the creation of gardens that were themselves works of art, which is where our exploration leads us next. The Japanese gardens created during the Edo period represent a distinctive approach to landscape design, not an attempt to recreate wild nature, but rather to create idealized, distilled versions of natural beauty, spaces designed for contemplation, where every rock and tree, every path and pond was carefully placed to create specific aesthetic and emotional effects. These were not gardens in the Western sense of flower beds and lawns, but rather compositions of stone and water, moss and pruned trees, spaces that invited walking and viewing, meditation and appreciation of subtle seasonal changes. The most austere form of garden was the karasansui, dry landscape garden, often associated with Zen temples. These gardens used no water at all. Instead, raked gravel or sand represented water, carefully positioned rock suggested mountains or islands, and the empty space between elements was as important as the elements themselves. The most famous example is Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto, where 15 rocks are arranged in a rectangular area of raked white gravel, in such a way that from any viewing angle, at least one rock is always hidden from sight, creating a composition that cannot be completely grasped, that invites contemplation of incompleteness and perspective. The act of raking the gravel in these gardens was itself a meditative practice, creating patterns that suggested waves or currents, patterns that would be destroyed and recreated daily, embodying the Buddhist concepts of impermanence and the necessity of continuous effort. Monks would rake early in the morning, their movements slow and deliberate. The sound of the rake on gravel a kind of meditation in itself. These gardens were meant to be viewed while sitting, from the veranda of the temple building, the perspective carefully considered so that the garden appeared balanced and complete from the primary viewing point. Stroll gardens, or kayushiki gardens, offered a different experience. These were larger spaces designed to be explored on foot, with paths that wound through various scenes, each turn revealing a new vista, a new composition of elements. As you walked, the garden would unfold like a scroll painting or a narrative, different areas creating different moods, a dark grove opening onto a bright pond, a narrow path through dense plantings leading to an open lawn. The great daimyo of the Edo period created magnificent stroll gardens at their estates, incorporating features that reference famous scenic spots from throughout Japan. Miniaturized landscapes that allowed the viewer to experience the essence of distant places without travelling. The most elaborate of these stroll gardens included artificial hills for viewing, islands connected by bridges, streams with carefully positioned rocks to create pleasing sounds of flowing water, tea houses situated at points where the garden could be appreciated from different angles. The Korakuen Garden in Okayama, completed in the late 1600s, incorporates a rice paddy as part of its design, a reminder that even beauty should acknowledge the agricultural foundation of society. The Kenrakuen Garden in Kanazawa, developed over centuries by the Maida clan, includes a pond fed by the Sai River through an elaborate system of channels with islands and bridges, with pine trees whose branches are supported by ropes arranged in umbrella patterns to protect them from heavy snow, creating sculptural forms that are both practical and beautiful. Trees and shrubs in these gardens were not allowed to grow naturally, but were pruned and trained into specific shapes that revealed their essential character while controlling their form. Pine trees were shaped to suggest age and endurance. Their branches trained horizontally to mimic the windswept pines of coastal cliffs. Azaleas were clipped into rounded mounds that looked like moss-covered boulders. Maples were thinned to reveal the elegant structure of their branches, creating patterns of light and shadow that changed with the seasons. This constant cultivation meant that the gardens were never static. They required ongoing attention, daily in some cases, to maintain the intended effects. The seasonal changes in these gardens were carefully choreographed through the selection and placement of plants. Cherry trees for spring blossoms, irises for early summer, maples for autumn colour, evergreens to provide structure in winter. Each season was meant to offer its own beauty, its own reasons for contemplation. But unlike Western gardens that often aimed for continuous bloom, for always having something flowering, Japanese gardens embraced the seasons more completely, including the barren beauty of winter, the subtle greens of new growth, the quiet periods between dramatic displays. The philosophy underlying garden design was deeply connected to other aspects of Edo period aesthetics. The appreciation for natural materials and forms, the value placed on subtlety and restraint, the importance of the space between things, the awareness of impermanence and change. All of these principles found expression in garden design, creating spaces that were simultaneously artificial, completely constructed, and natural, embodying idealized versions of natural beauty. And these spaces served practical purposes. They were places for walking and viewing, for entertaining guests at tea gatherings, for demonstrating taste and wealth. But they were also meant to inspire contemplation, to create moments of awareness and appreciation, to connect the viewer to the natural world even in the heart of a crowded city. The creation and maintenance of these gardens represented enormous investments of resources, labour and expertise, yet they were valued not just as displays of wealth, but as cultural achievements, as embodiments of aesthetic principles that defined what it meant to have refined taste in the Edo period. And in this they were similar to other aspects of elite culture, beautiful, rule-bound, expensive, and deeply meaningful to those who understood their codes and references, which brings us, as we move into the fourth act of our journey, to consider the lives of those who lived within, but partially hidden from this carefully ordered world. The lives of women in Edo period Japan were shaped and constrained by strict social hierarchies and Confucian ideologies that emphasized obedience, duty, and submission to male authority at every stage of life, first to fathers, then to husbands, and finally to sons in old age. The ideal woman, according to the moral guides and conduct books that proliferated during the period, was quiet, modest, skilled in domestic arts, devoted to her family, and accepting of her subordinate position in the social order. But beneath this official ideology, women's actual lives were more complex, more varied, and occasionally more autonomous than the prescriptive text suggested. For women of the samurai class, life was particularly constrained and formal. They lived in the inner quarters of their family compounds, separated from the outer areas where men conducted business and received visitors. Their movements were restricted, their activities monitored, their primary purpose understood to be the production of male heirs and the maintenance of household order. Young samurai women were educated in the accomplishments appropriate to their class, reading and writing Japanese if not Chinese, poetry composition, perhaps music or flower arrangement, all of the refined arts that would make them suitable wives for men of similar rank. Marriage for these women was entirely a family matter, arranged to create alliances between households, to strengthen political connections, to consolidate wealth or territory. Love was irrelevant. Compatibility was considered in terms of family background and temperament, but not in terms of personal affection or romantic attraction. A bride would leave her natal family and join her husband's household, where she would be under the authority of her mother-in-law until she herself became a mother, and particularly the mother of sons, which was the only route to power and security within the patriarchal family structure. Divorce was possible, but deeply shameful for women. A divorced woman returned to her natal family in disgrace, her chances of remarriage slim, her position precarious. Men, by contrast, could divorce relatively easily, and many samurai had concubines in addition to their official wives, a practice that was accepted as long as the hierarchy between wife and concubine was maintained. The wife managed the household and bore the legitimate heirs, the concubines provided companionship and pleasure, and both were expected to accept this arrangement without complaint. For women of the merchant and artisan classes, life often involved more practical activity and sometimes more autonomy, though still within strict limits. These women frequently worked alongside their husbands in family businesses, managing shops, keeping accounts, dealing with customers. A merchant's wife might have significant responsibility for the economic success of the household, and a widow might take over a business entirely if she had no adult sons, becoming a recognized businesswoman in her own right. Some women became quite wealthy through these activities, though social convention required them to be modest about their success. Farming women had the hardest physical lives, working in the fields alongside men during planting and harvest seasons, managing household economies that operated on thin margins, raising children and caring for elderly relatives, all while maintaining the deference and obedience expected of women in a Confucian social order. For these women, the theoretical subordination preached in conduct books must have seemed like a luxury compared to the practical necessities of survival in a subsistence agricultural economy. There were also women who lived outside the conventional social structures entirely, the courtesans and entertainers of the pleasure quarters, who were simultaneously the most famous women in Japan and officially classified as outcasts. These women, particularly the high-ranking oiran, achieved a kind of celebrity and exercised a degree of choice in their clients and their lives that was impossible for respectable women, but this freedom came at enormous cost. Most had been sold into the profession as children, were trapped by debt, and would age out of desirability into poverty and obscurity. Education for women was a complicated topic. Literacy among women increased significantly during the Edo period, particularly in urban areas, where merchant and samurai women were taught to read hiragana, the phonetic script considered appropriate for women, even if they were not taught the Chinese characters that were the foundation of male education. This literacy allowed women to read novels and poetry, to write letters and diaries, and some women became accomplished poets and writers despite the lack of formal educational opportunities. The novelist Ihara Saikeku wrote popular fiction that featured women's perspectives and experiences, suggesting that there was an audience of literate women interested in stories about their own lives. There were even a few women who achieved recognition as scholars or artists, though they had to overcome enormous obstacles to do so. The poet Kaga no Chiyo is remembered for her haiku, which often dealt with women's experiences and domestic scenes, bringing a distinctively female voice to a form dominated by men. The painter Kiyohara Yukinobu was celebrated for her work in the Kano school style, though she remained exceptional, her success highlighting rather than changing the general exclusion of women from professional artistic training. What emerges from looking at women's lives in the Edo period is a picture of constraint and hierarchy, but also of resilience and complexity. Women found ways to create meaningful lives within structures that limited them, to exercise power in domestic spheres, to develop their own cultural practices and communities. And while the official ideology of female subordination was powerful and pervasive, women's actual experiences were varied and sometimes surprisingly independent within the bounds of what was socially acceptable, and these complexities become even more apparent when we look at one particular space where women's lives and urban culture intersected in complicated ways. The Yoshiwara, that walled district on the northern edge of Edo where the pleasure quarters were located, contained within its boundaries a world that operated according to rules very different from those of the city outside, a space where money could buy temporary intimacy, and where beauty and wit were commodities to be sold, yet where real relationships sometimes developed, and where human emotions complicated the commercial transactions that were supposed to define every interaction. To understand the Edo period completely, we need to understand the Yoshiwara, both as entertainment district and as place of genuine suffering, both as site of cultural creativity and as mechanism of exploitation. The women who worked in the Yoshiwara, and they numbered in the thousands during the district's height in the 18th century, arrived there through various routes, though few, if any, involved genuine choice. Some were sold by impoverished families who received payment in exchange for their daughter's service, contracts that specified years of labour, though these contracts were often manipulated and extended through accounting tricks that kept women in debt indefinitely. Others were recruited by procurers who promised employment in cities and delivered young girls into brothels instead. A few were daughters of courtesans, born into the profession with no other options available. The hierarchy within the Yoshiwara was rigid and carefully maintained, with the oiran at the top living lives of relative luxury, attended by servants, able to refuse clients they found distasteful, earning substantial sums, though most of this money went to the house owners rather than to the women themselves. These highest-ranking courtesans were cultural icons, their hairstyles and clothing copied throughout Edo. Their favoured clients envied. Their opinions on matters of taste and style influential in ways that far exceeded their official social status as outcasts. They were accomplished in arts and conversation, trained in tea ceremony and poetry, music and dance, able to entertain guests with wit and cultural references that demonstrated the education they had received within the system that also exploited them. Below the oiran were ranks of other courtesans, each level marked by subtle differences in dress and behaviour. The cheaper the category, the less autonomy the women had, the more clients they were expected to serve, the harsher their working conditions. At the bottom were women who worked in the lowest establishments, serving men too poor or too drunk to attract the attention of higher-ranking courtesans. Women whose lives were difficult in ways that were deliberately hidden from the romanticised image of the Yoshiwara that circulated in Ukiyo-e prints and popular fiction. The day-to-day life of a courtesan involved elaborate grooming and preparation, hours spent on hair and makeup, dressing in layers of heavy kimono that could weigh dozens of pounds, maintaining the appearance of glamour and availability while often feeling exhausted and constrained. Evenings involved sitting on display in windows where potential clients could view and choose, negotiating rates and terms through intermediaries, entertaining in banquet rooms where food and drink and music created an atmosphere of indulgence and escape. For the clients, this was entertainment and temporary escape from the rigid social hierarchies of the outside world. For the women, it was work, labour that used their bodies and their emotional energy, that required them to perform desire and pleasure whether they felt it or not. Yet within this commercial framework, real relationships sometimes developed. Courtesans and clients who saw each other regularly over months or years sometimes formed genuine attachments. though the economic inequality underlying these relationships meant they could never be truly equal. Some wealthy clients would buy out a favoured courtesan's contract, effectively purchasing her freedom so they could marry her or set her up as a mistress, though such redemptions were rare and often complicated by debts that had been deliberately inflated to make freedom impossible. Stories of lovers who killed themselves together when they could not be together in life. The double suicides, called shinju, became popular subjects for kabuki plays and novels, romanticizing what were often desperate acts born of impossible situations. The Yoshiwara also functioned as a kind of cultural laboratory where new artistic forms developed and where the boundaries of acceptable behaviour were tested. Senryu, a form of poetry similar to haiku but often satirical and irreverent, flourished in the pleasure quarters where people felt freer to mock authority and convention. New styles of music and dance originated in the Yoshiwara and spread to respectable society. The intimate knowledge of human desire and weakness that courtesans accumulated made them sophisticated observers of social pretension and hypocrisy, and this perspective occasionally found expression in art and literature that subtly criticised the very system that exploited them. The authorities' relationship with the Yoshiwara was deeply hypocritical, officially condemning prostitution as immoral, while simultaneously licensing it and profiting from taxes on the trade, preaching Confucian values of female virtue, while ensuring that a substantial population of women were required to violate those values for male entertainment. This hypocrisy was widely recognised, joked about in popular culture, yet the system persisted because it served useful purposes. Containing prostitution in one location where it could be monitored and taxed, providing a release valve for social and sexual tensions that might otherwise threaten public order, creating a space where class hierarchies could be temporarily inverted in ways that probably reinforced them by making transgression special and purchased rather than revolutionary. The legacy of the Yoshiwara is complicated. It was undeniably a site of exploitation and suffering, a system that commodified women and trapped them in lives they had not chosen. Yet it was also a space where cultural creativity flourished, where art and poetry developed, where some women exercised more agency and earned more money than they could have in any respectable occupation available to them, and these contradictions resist simple moral judgments, inviting instead a recognition that human societies often contain such complexities, spaces where beauty and cruelty, creativity and exploitation coexist in ways that challenge our desire for clear categories, which brings us to a very different aspect of Edo period life, the festivals and seasonal celebrations that structured time and created community. The Edo period year was punctuated by festivals and seasonal observances that provided rhythm and meaning to daily life, creating shared experiences that cut across class boundaries and allowed for temporary release from the usual rules and hierarchies that governed society. These festivals were not optional amusements, but integral parts of the social fabric, moments when community came together, when normal work ceased, when the boundaries between sacred and secular, between human and divine, became permeable and negotiable. The calendar itself was both lunar and solar, creating a complex system of dates and observances that required attention and knowledge to navigate properly. The year began with the New Year celebrations, called Shogatsu, a multi-day festival that was the most important observance of the entire calendar. Preparations began weeks in advance. Houses were cleaned thoroughly to remove the old year's accumulated grime and bad luck. Debts were settled so that no obligations carried over into the new year. Special foods were prepared, including mochi rice cakes that were offered to the gods and shared among family members. On New Year's Eve, temple bells would ring 108 times, once for each of the human delusions recognized in Buddhist teaching, the sound carrying across cities and villages as the old year ended and the new one began. The first days of the new year were times of visits and gift-giving, of wearing new clothes and eating special foods, of consulting fortune-tellers and visiting shrines to pray for good luck in the months ahead. Children received money in decorated envelopes from their elders, Shops and offices closed for several days, and the normal concerns of work and duty were temporarily set aside. For samurai, the New Year was an occasion for formal visits to superiors and for renewing vows of loyalty. Wearing ceremonial dress and participating in rituals that reinforced the hierarchies they lived within. For ordinary people, it was a time of hope and renewal, a chance to start fresh with clean houses and cleared debts. As winter gave way to spring, the festival of Setsubun marked the transition, with people throwing roasted beans while shouting to drive out demons and invite good fortune, a noisy, energetic ritual that children particularly enjoyed. Then came Hinamatsuri, the doll festival or Girls' Day, when families with daughters would display elaborate sets of dolls representing the imperial court, dressed in ancient costume, arranged on tiered platforms. These dolls were heirlooms passed down through generations, and displaying them properly was a way of praying for daughters' happiness and successful marriages. The arrival of cherry blossoms in early spring was and remains one of the most important events in the Japanese year, celebrated with hanami, flower viewing parties where people would gather under blooming cherry trees to eat and drink and compose poetry. To appreciate the brief period of perfect beauty before the petals began to fall. The transience of the blossoms, their peak lasting only a few days before wind and rain scattered them, made them perfect symbols of mono no aware, that gentle sadness at the impermanence of beautiful things. All classes participated in hanami. From daimyo, who held elaborate parties in their garden estates, to farmers, who took breaks from spring planting to view the blossoms in nearby groves. Summer brought the Tanabata festival in the 7th month, celebrating the legend of 2 stars, the weaver and the cowherd, who could meet only once a year when a bridge of magpies formed across the Milky Way. People wrote wishes on strips of paper and tied them to bamboo branches, hoping that these prayers would be carried to the heavens. Later in summer came the Bon Festival, a Buddhist observance when the spirits of the dead were believed to return to visit their families, welcomed with lanterns lit to guide them home, honoured with offerings of food and prayers, sent off again with floating lanterns set adrift on rivers or the sea. Autumn brought harvest festivals that varied by region but generally involved thanksgiving for the rice crop that would sustain the community through the coming year, offerings made at shrines and temples, communities coming together to celebrate survival and plenty. The autumn moon viewing, tsukimi, was another occasion for parties and poetry. People gathering to appreciate the particularly clear and bright full moon of the 9th month, seeing in it both beauty and melancholy as summer ended and winter approached. These festivals served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment or religious observance. They marked time in memorable ways, creating a shared calendar of experiences that everyone in a community could reference. They provided occasions for social bonding and for reinforcing community ties. They allowed for temporary escape from the grinding routines of work and obligation, and they created spaces where normal rules could be suspended or inverted, where samurai and commoners might mingle more freely than usual, where women could venture outside their usual restricted spaces, where children could be noisy and playful in ways that everyday life did not permit. The shogunate generally supported these festivals because they served useful social functions, providing entertainment and release while channeling energy into traditional controllable forms. Occasionally authorities would try to limit festival excesses, prohibiting particularly rowdy celebrations or expensive displays that seemed to threaten social order or propriety, but these restrictions were often ignored or minimally enforced, the festivals being too important to community life to be effectively suppressed. And in the rhythm of these festivals, in the movement from New Year to cherry blossoms to summer heat to autumn harvest to winter cold and back again to New Year, people found meaning and structure, a sense of connection to cycles larger than their individual lives, to nature and community and the turning of the seasons, which connects to something else that flourished during the long peace of Edo, the spread of education and literacy to levels unprecedented in Japanese history. One of the Edo period's most significant but often overlooked achievements was the spread of education and literacy throughout Japanese society to a degree that was remarkable for a pre-modern era, creating a population that was among the most literate in the world by the time the period ended. This was not the result of government policy or mandatory schooling, but rather emerged from a combination of factors: the long peace that made investment in education practical, the growth of commercial economy that required people who could read and calculate, and cultural values that prized learning and self-improvement across all social classes. For samurai, education was both a practical necessity and a mark of status. With no wars to fight, literacy and administrative skill became more important than martial prowess, and samurai families invested heavily in their sons' education, hiring tutors or sending boys to domain schools where they studied the Confucian classics, learned to read and write classical Chinese, practiced calligraphy, and studied mathematics and history. These domain schools, called Hanko, proliferated during the Edo period, with most domains establishing at least one school by the late 1700s, some maintaining multiple schools of different levels and specializations. The curriculum in these schools emphasized moral education as much as practical skills. Students read Confucian texts that taught proper relationships and hierarchies, loyalty and filial piety, the importance of self-cultivation and ethical behavior. But they also studied more practical subjects: mathematics for managing domain finances, medicine for treating illness, military tactics, even though peace made their application unlikely. Some schools included Dutch learning in their later years, recognizing that Western knowledge was becoming increasingly important for defense and governance. For commoners, education was less formal, but often remarkably widespread. In cities and large towns, private academies called shijuku taught basic literacy and numeracy to the sons of merchants and artisans, sometimes to daughters as well, preparing them for work in family businesses that required reading contracts, keeping accounts, and corresponding with suppliers and customers. The costs of these schools were modest, making them accessible to relatively ordinary families who saw education as an investment in their children's futures. Even more widespread were the terakoya, temple schools that operated in villages and small towns throughout Japan, teaching basic reading, writing, and arithmetic to children of farmers and lower-ranking townspeople. These schools, often run by priests or by educated villagers, used simple texts and practical examples to teach children the hiragana and katakana syllabaries, and enough kanji characters to read simple documents and letters. By the late Edo period, it's estimated that literacy rates among commoner men reached 40 to 50% in some regions, extraordinarily high for a pre-modern society, and female literacy, while lower, was also significant, perhaps 15 to 20% in urban areas. This literacy created a huge market for printed materials, and publishers in cities like Edo and Osaka produced books on every conceivable subject: popular fiction and poetry collections, travel guides and moral tales, technical manuals on everything from farming to flower arrangement to go strategy, illustrated encyclopedias that catalogued plants and animals, humorous picture books and erotic novels, cheap entertainments and serious literature, all circulating through rental libraries and bookstores that made reading material accessible, even to people who could not afford to buy books. The reading public that emerged during the Edo period was voracious and varied. Merchants reading works on commercial ethics and business practices, samurai consuming historical novels about earlier periods of warfare and valor, women reading romance tales and guides to proper behavior, farmers consulting agricultural manuals and almanacs, everyone enjoying humorous stories and satirical verse that poked fun at human foibles and social pretensions. This shared literacy created something like a national culture, people in different regions reading the same books, following the same serialized stories, discussing the same literary controversies. Education also spread through less formal means, through apprenticeship systems where young people learned trades from masters, acquiring not just technical skills, but also the literacy and numeracy needed for their profession. A carpenter's apprentice would learn to read technical drawings and calculate measurements. A merchant's clerk would master account keeping and contract interpretation. Even relatively humble occupations required some literacy, and people who started life unable to read often acquired basic skills through their work and through the help of literate family members or neighbours. The shogunate's attitude toward education was generally supportive within limits. They encouraged samurai education to create competent administrators. They tolerated commoner education because it made people more governable and economically productive. But they were wary of education that might lead to questioning of the social order. Books that seemed politically dangerous could be banned. Teachers who expressed heterodox ideas could be punished. And there were periodic attempts to restrict what commoners were allowed to study. To keep them focused on practical subjects appropriate to their station, rather than on high culture or philosophy that might give them ideas above their position. But despite these occasional restrictions, education continued to spread, driven by demand from families who saw it as a pathway to modest upward mobility, or at least to maintaining their current position, by economic forces that rewarded literacy, and by cultural values that prized learning for its own sake. And by the time the Edo period ended, Japan had an educational infrastructure and a literate population that would prove crucial in the country's rapid modernization. A foundation that was built slowly over generations of peace, which leads us to contemplate the peace itself, what isolation preserved and what it cost. For 265 years, from 1603 to 1868, Japan experienced continuous peace. No wars between domains, no invasions from outside, no civil conflicts that threatened to tear the country apart. This was unprecedented in Japanese history and remarkable in world history. A period when samurai carried swords they never used in battle, when castle walls were never tested by siege, when the arts of war became purely ceremonial. To understand what this long peace meant, what it preserved and what it cost, we need to step back and consider the Edo period as a whole, to contemplate the choice that Japan made to close itself off from the world and what that choice achieved. The most obvious accomplishment of the long peace was survival. Japan remained independent and intact at a time when European colonial powers were conquering much of Asia, when China was being carved into spheres of influence, when Southeast Asian kingdoms were falling under European control. By closing its borders, Japan avoided the fate of colonization. There were no foreign missionaries creating fifth columns, no European trading companies demanding extraterritorial rights, no Western military forces establishing beachheads. The Sakoku policy, for all its restrictiveness, accomplished its primary goal of preserving Japanese sovereignty and preventing the kind of foreign domination that consumed so much of the non-European world during this period. The peace also allowed for cultural development of extraordinary depth and refinement. The arts and crafts we have explored, Ukiyo-e and Kabuki, tea ceremony and haiku, ceramics and garden design. All of these achieved levels of excellence that probably would not have been possible in a time of constant warfare and upheaval. Artists and craftspeople could work within stable traditions, refining techniques over generations, developing aesthetic principles to high levels of sophistication. The great daimyo could invest in cultural patronage rather than military preparedness, building gardens and collecting tea utensils, supporting artists and scholars, creating an elite culture of remarkable refinement. The long peace also fostered economic development, even within the constraints of the Edo system. Agriculture became more productive through the spread of improved techniques and new crop varieties. Population grew until the early 1700s before stabilizing. Cities flourished as centers of commerce and culture. A sophisticated market economy developed that connected all regions of Japan through trade networks. Literacy and education spread. Infrastructure improved with better roads and more reliable bridges and ferries. Life for many people, though still hard by modern standards, became more secure, more predictable, less brutal than it had been during the age of warring states. But the isolation also had costs that became increasingly apparent as the period progressed. Japan fell behind in military technology. The kind of advancement that was happening in Europe through constant warfare and competition did not happen in Japan because there was no pressure to innovate, no need to develop better weapons or tactics. By the mid-1800s, when Western ships began appearing in Japanese waters with increasing frequency, the technological gap was alarming. Japanese coastal defences with their ancient cannons and samurai with swords faced steam-powered warships with modern artillery, and everyone recognised that if conflict came, Japan would be hopelessly outmatched. The isolation also created a kind of intellectual insularity. Despite the efforts of Rangaku scholars, most Japanese had little understanding of the enormous changes happening in the world outside, the Industrial Revolution transforming economies, the rise of nation-states replacing older forms of political organisation, the scientific discoveries revolutionising understanding of nature and the cosmos. Japan had preserved its culture intact, but at the cost of falling behind in ways that would prove dangerous when isolation could no longer be maintained. There was also a social cost to the rigid hierarchies and tight controls that maintained the peace. People were born into positions they could not leave, trapped in hereditary occupations and class positions. Talented individuals from lower classes had almost no opportunity to rise based on merit, and the system's emphasis on maintaining stability meant that innovation and change were generally suppressed rather than encouraged. The peace was built on control, on limiting movement and choice, on maintaining hierarchies that may have been functional, but were also often unjust and stifling. As the Edo period progressed, particularly in its later decades, there was a growing sense among some intellectuals and officials that the system was becoming unsustainable, that the rigid social structure was creating tensions that would eventually have to be addressed, that isolation from the outside world was becoming more dangerous as Western power grew, that reform was necessary but also threatening to the entire edifice of Tokugawa control. These tensions remained mostly beneath the surface as long as isolation could be maintained, but they were building, waiting for the shock that would finally force Japan to confront the choices it had made and to consider very different futures. The long peace of Edo was an extraordinary achievement, a deliberate choice to prioritize stability over growth, cultural refinement over technological advancement, sovereignty over engagement with the wider world, and for 2.5 centuries this choice worked. It preserved Japan's independence, allowed for cultural flowering, gave ordinary people lives that were more secure than those of their ancestors. Whether the costs of this choice were worth the benefits is a question without a simple answer. It depends on values and priorities, on whether one prizes freedom or security, innovation or tradition, engagement or autonomy. What's clear is that the long peace could not last forever, that the world outside was changing in ways that would eventually force Japan to change as well, and that the end of isolation, when it came, would come not from within but from without, which is where our story moves next, as we enter the final act of our journey through the Edo period. In the early decades of the 1800s, the isolation that had defined Japan for 2 centuries began to show cracks, not from internal collapse but from external pressure that was becoming impossible to ignore. Foreign ships appearing with increasing frequency in Japanese waters, testing the boundaries of the Sakoku policy, demanding trade and assistance, making clear that the world beyond Japan's shores had not forgotten about the closed island nation and would not indefinitely respect its desire to remain apart. These encounters, initially sporadic and relatively easily managed, grew more frequent and more challenging as Western powers expanded their reach across the Pacific and into East Asian waters, bringing with them technologies and attitudes that made Japan's isolation increasingly untenable. The first serious challenges came from Russian ships probing southward from their territories in the north, appearing in waters around Hokkaido and the Kuril Islands, seeking trade and diplomatic relations, bringing maps and gifts and proposals that the shogunate consistently refused but could not entirely dismiss. Then came British ships from their expanding empire in Asia, sailing into Japanese harbours, demanding supplies and assistance for sailors, testing Japanese resolve and defences. American whaling ships, hunting the great whales that swam in the Pacific, occasionally sought refuge in Japanese ports when damaged by storms or when crew members needed medical attention, and the shogunate faced the dilemma of how to respond. Traditional policy demanded that these ships be turned away, but doing so might provoke the very conflicts that isolation was meant to prevent. The shogunate's responses to these intrusions were inconsistent and sometimes contradictory, revealing the internal debates about how to handle the foreign pressure. Some officials argued for strict enforcement of seclusion, demanding that foreign ships be fired upon if they refused to leave, insisting that any relaxation of policy would be the beginning of the end for Tokugawa control. Others, particularly those influenced by Rangaku Learning, recognized that Japan's military weakness made confrontation dangerous, that Western ships with modern cannons could destroy Japanese coastal defences with relative ease, and that some accommodation might be necessary to buy time for Japan to strengthen itself. A particularly troubling incident occurred in 1837 when an American merchant ship, the Morrison, attempted to return 7 Japanese castaways who had been rescued at sea, hoping this humanitarian gesture would open trade relations. The ship was fired upon by Japanese coastal batteries, driven away without being allowed to land the castaways, and this harsh response provoked significant debate within Japan. Some Rangaku scholars openly criticized the decision, arguing that the shogunate's rigid adherence to isolation had caused Japan to refuse a kindness and to treat potential friends as enemies, suggesting that the policy needed to be reconsidered in light of changing circumstances. The scholar Takano Choei wrote a pamphlet criticizing the Morrison incident, arguing that Japan needed to learn from Western countries rather than simply rejecting all contact. And for this heterodox opinion he was arrested and eventually died in prison, a martyr to the idea that isolation had become a dangerous anachronism. His fate demonstrated that the shogunate was not yet ready to abandon Sakoku, but it also revealed that the consensus supporting isolation was fracturing. That educated people were beginning to question whether the policy that had served Japan well for 2 centuries remained appropriate in a world that had changed dramatically since the early 1600s. The shogunate attempted various responses to the growing foreign presence, strengthening coastal defences with new cannons cast according to Western designs, establishing training programs in Western military tactics and gunnery, commissioning Dutch learning texts on naval technology and fortification, but these efforts were hampered by lack of resources, by political resistance from those who saw Western learning as dangerous, and by the fundamental contradiction that Japan was trying to learn from the West, while maintaining policies designed to keep the West out. The domains that were most exposed to foreign contact, particularly Satsuma in the south and Choshu in the southwest, began their own modernization programs, acquiring Western weapons and training their samurai in Western military methods, acting with increasing independence from the shogunate's central authority. Internal political tensions were rising as well. The shogunate's inability to decisively handle the foreign threat undermined its authority and prestige, and some domains began to see opportunity in this weakness, a chance to challenge Tokugawa supremacy and to reimagine Japan's political structure. The whispers of change that had begun as foreign ships on the horizon were becoming louder, more insistent, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and expectation, a sense that the long peace and isolation that had defined the Edo period for so long were entering their final phase, that something was coming that would force Japan to make fundamental choices about its place in the world and its political future, and this sense would prove entirely correct when, in the summer of 1853, 4 American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay, bringing with them an ultimatum that Japan could not ignore and a confrontation that would change everything. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was not merely a change of government, but a fundamental transformation of Japanese society, economy and culture. a deliberate revolution from above designed to remake Japan into a modern nation-state capable of defending itself against Western imperialism and eventually of competing with Western powers on equal terms. The leaders of the new government, many of them samurai from Satsuma and Choshu who had fought to overthrow the shogunate, recognized that defeating the Tokugawa was only the first step, that Japan needed to modernize rapidly and comprehensively if it was to avoid the fate of colonization that had befallen so much of Asia, and they set about this task with remarkable energy and thoroughness, dismantling the structures of the Edo period and building something radically new in their place. One of the first and most dramatic changes was the abolition of the domains and the creation of a centralized state. The Heian Chiken reform of 1871 dissolved all the daimyo domains that had existed for centuries, replacing them with prefectures governed by officials appointed by the central government, concentrating political power in Tokyo, the new name for Edo, and eliminating the autonomous regional authorities that had characterized the Edo system. The daimyo themselves were pensioned off, compensated for the loss of their domains but stripped of their political power, transformed from feudal lords into aristocrats in a new peerage system modelled on European nobility. Even more revolutionary was the abolition of the samurai class itself, accomplished through a series of reforms in the 1870s that eliminated samurai privileges, abolished their stipends, forbade the wearing of swords in public, and opened all occupations and positions to talent regardless of birth, destroying at a stroke the rigid class system that had defined Edo society. Samurai who had spent their lives training for positions that no longer existed, who had identified themselves through their class status and their swords, found themselves suddenly equal under law to farmers and merchants, their traditional sources of income and identity gone, their entire worldview rendered obsolete by government decree. The Meiji government pursued modernization with systematic intensity, sending missions to Europe and America to study Western institutions and technologies, hiring foreign experts to teach everything from military tactics to educational methods to industrial techniques, building railroads and telegraphs, establishing a conscript army that drew soldiers from all classes rather than relying on a warrior elite, creating a modern navy with steel ships and modern weapons, developing industries from textiles to steel production, reforming the tax system to generate revenue for all this development, compulsory education to create a literate and skilled workforce. The cultural changes were equally profound. The government promoted Western dress and Western customs among elites, encouraged the adoption of Western science and technology, reformed the calendar to match Western dating, even promoted eating meat, which had been largely forbidden under Buddhist influence during the Edo period. The goal was comprehensive Westernization in practical matters while attempting to preserve what were considered essential elements of Japanese spirit and culture, a delicate balance that was never entirely stable or uncontested. These transformations were traumatic for many people, particularly for former samurai who saw their entire way of life swept away. And there were rebellions against the new order, most dramatically the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 led by Saigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, who had become disillusioned with the government's direction. Saigo's rebel army, composed largely of disaffected samurai, fought the new conscript army in battles that pitted traditional samurai warfare against modern military organization, and the defeat of the rebels demonstrated conclusively that the age of the samurai was over, that the new Japan had no place for the warrior class that had dominated the Edo period. By 1890, barely 2 decades after the Meiji Restoration, Japan had been transformed almost beyond recognition. From the country Perry had encountered in 1853, it had a constitution and a parliament modelled on European examples, though with very limited democracy. It had modern industries and infrastructure. It had a powerful military that could compete with Western forces. It had abolished feudalism and class restrictions, had created a modern educational system, had established itself as a regional power that other nations had to take seriously. The transformation was so rapid and comprehensive that Western observers marveled at Japan's ability to modernize while maintaining its independence, something that almost no other non-Western nation had managed to achieve. But this transformation came at significant costs. The destruction of traditional social structures left many people disoriented and displaced. The rapid industrialization created harsh working conditions and social problems. The emphasis on national strength and military power would eventually lead Japan down paths of aggression and imperialism that would end in catastrophe in the mid-20th century, and many of the refinements and beauties of Edo period culture were lost or devalued in the rush to modernize, seen as old-fashioned or irrelevant to the project of building a strong modern state. The Meiji transformation was necessary, given the circumstances Japan faced. The choice was between modernization and colonization, between becoming a modern power or becoming a Western colony, and the Meiji leaders chose the former and pursued it with remarkable success. But it also meant the end of the world we've been exploring in this long journey through the Edo period, the end of isolation and class hierarchy, of samurai and shoguns, of the floating world and the tea ceremony as living centers of culture rather than preserved traditions. The end of a particular way of being Japanese that had flourished for 2.5 centuries in the unique conditions of peace and isolation. And this brings us to our final contemplation, to the question of what the Edo period left behind, what endures from those 265 years of chosen separation from the world. As we approach the end of our journey through the Edo period, it's worth contemplating what endures from those 2.5 centuries, what legacy that age of peace and isolation left to modern Japan and to the world. What elements of Edo culture and society survived the transformations of the Meiji period and continue to influence Japanese life and thought even today, more than 1.5 centuries after the shogunate fell and the doors to the world were thrown open. The Edo period is not just historical curiosity, not just a fascinating example of an alternative way of organizing society, but a living presence in contemporary Japan, visible in aesthetics and attitudes, in cultural practices and values, in the ways Japanese people think about beauty and community, tradition and innovation. The most obvious legacy is aesthetic. The arts and crafts that flourished during the Edo period continue to define what many people, both Japanese and foreign, think of as traditionally Japanese, the ukiyo-e prints that influenced Impressionism and continue to be collected and exhibited around the world. The ceramics with their wabi-sabi appreciation for imperfection and age, the gardens with their careful composition of natural elements. The tea ceremony with its emphasis on presence and attention, the haiku with its distillation of moment and meaning into 17 syllables, all of these art forms that achieved their definitive forms during the Edo period remain vital parts of Japanese cultural heritage, practiced and studied, preserved and reinterpreted by contemporary artists and practitioners. The Edo period's emphasis on craftsmanship, on the patient perfection of technique through years of dedicated practice, continues to characterize many Japanese approaches to work and art. The idea that mastery requires complete dedication, that there is value in doing even humble tasks with extraordinary care, that the process of making is as important as the object made. These attitudes can be traced back to the artisan culture of the Edo period, to the workshops and schools where skills were passed down through generations, where apprentices spent years learning to do things correctly before being allowed to innovate, where the connection between maker and object was understood to be profound and sacred. The Edo period also left a legacy of high literacy and education. The schools and learning culture that developed during the long peace created a foundation that the Meiji government built upon when it established compulsory education. The assumption that ordinary people should be able to read and write, that education was valuable for everyone, not just for elites. This democratic approach to learning has its roots in the terracotta and domain schools of the Edo period, in the popular literature and woodblock prints that assumed a reading public that crossed class boundaries. Less tangibly, but perhaps more importantly, the Edo period left a legacy of thinking about community and social relationships, about the balance between individual desire and collective obligation, about the importance of maintaining harmony and avoiding conflict, about the value of ritual and form in structuring interactions. These social patterns that developed during the Edo period, when peace depended on everyone knowing their place and fulfilling their roles, continue to influence Japanese society in complex ways, both positive in fostering social cohesion and consideration for others, and sometimes restrictive in limiting individual expression and enforcing conformity. The Edo period also demonstrates that isolation and engagement are choices with consequences, that closing off from the world can preserve autonomy and allow for cultural development but also creates vulnerabilities and can leave a society unprepared for inevitable changes. The lesson that Japan learned from the Edo period is complicated. Isolation worked for 2 centuries. It achieved its goals of preserving independence and allowing for cultural flourishing. But it also created weaknesses that became dangerous when isolation could no longer be maintained. And the trauma of the forced opening and the rush to modernize has shaped Japanese attitudes toward the outside world ever since, creating a complex relationship between pride in Japanese uniqueness and awareness of the need to engage with global forces. For the world beyond Japan, the Edo period offers lessons about what is possible when a society commits to peace, when warfare is eliminated as a normal part of political life, when resources that would go to military competition can instead be invested in culture and refinement. The arts and crafts that flourished during the Edo period demonstrate what human creativity can achieve when given time and stability, when traditions can develop over generations without being destroyed by conflict. And while the conditions that made the Edo period possible, the geographic isolation, the political system, the specific historical circumstances, cannot be replicated, the example remains significant, a demonstration that societies can choose peace and can create remarkable cultural achievements when they do. The Edo period also reminds us that human societies are complex and contradictory, that the same system can produce both extraordinary beauty and rigid oppression, that peace can coexist with injustice, that cultural refinement can flourish within structures of control and hierarchy. The Edo period was not a utopia. It trapped people in hereditary classes, it subordinated women, it exploited the poor and the outcast. It maintained order through surveillance and punishment. But it also created art of transcendent beauty, allowed for the development of sophisticated urban culture, gave ordinary people lives that were more secure than those of their ancestors, and any honest assessment must acknowledge both the achievements and the costs. As we contemplate the Edo period from our vantage point in the 21st century, from a world that is completely interconnected and changing with dizzying speed, there is something both attractive and cautionary about this long age of peace and isolation, attractive in its demonstration of what focus and stability can achieve, in its creation of beauty and meaning, in its preservation of traditions, cautionary in its rigidity and its ultimate vulnerability to forces it tried to exclude. The Edo period ended more than a century and a half ago, but it continues to matter, continues to shape and inspire, continues to offer lessons and questions about how societies can organize themselves, what they can achieve, what they must sacrifice, what endures and what changes. And in these questions lies the final legacy of those 265 years when Japan closed its doors and created something remarkable in the quiet space that isolation provided. And so we have travelled together through 265 years of Japanese history, from Tokugawa Ieyasu's decisive victory at Sekigahara in 1600, through the long peace that followed, through the decision to close the country and the culture that flourished in isolation, through the arts and crafts and social structures of the Edo period, all the way to the arrival of Perry's black ships and the transformation that followed, the end of the shogunate and the beginning of modern Japan. It has been a long journey. Nearly 2.5 hours we have spent together exploring this distinctive period, and I hope it has been time well spent, that you have learned something, felt something. found moments of interest or beauty in this story of an isolated nation and the remarkable culture it created. The question I posed at the beginning, what it means when a society deliberately steps away from the wider world for more than 2 centuries, has, I think, no simple answer. The Edo period demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of isolation, both what can be preserved and what must eventually be confronted. Japan's choice to close itself off allowed for cultural development of extraordinary depth and refinement, for peace and stability that lasted longer than most nations ever achieve, but it also created vulnerabilities and left Japan unprepared for the inevitable moment when isolation could no longer be maintained. Perhaps the answer is that isolation, like all choices, has costs and benefits that must be weighed against each other, that there is no perfect solution to the problem of how societies should relate to the wider world, only different compromises with different consequences. What we've learned through our exploration, as honestly as I can express it, is that the Edo period was neither utopian paradise nor oppressive prison, but rather a complex human society with achievements and failures, beauty and injustice, innovation and rigidity, a society that made specific choices about how to organize itself and lived with the consequences of those choices for 2.5 centuries, creating in the process a culture of such distinctiveness and refinement that it continues to influence and inspire the world today, more than 150 years after the system that created it collapsed and gave way to something entirely different. If you enjoyed this slow drift through Edo Japan, this exploration of a world that chose peace and isolation and created something remarkable within those constraints, I would be grateful if you would like and subscribe, and perhaps leave a comment sharing your thoughts or questions. These peaceful explorations of history reach more people when viewers engage with them, and knowing that these videos matter to someone makes the research and creation worthwhile. And to those of you who are already subscribed, who return for these long journeys through time, thank you for being part of this community, for valuing this approach to history that prioritizes depth and calm over sensation and urgency. Wherever you are in the world as you listen to this, whether you're in a quiet room at night or settling in for rest, whether you found this video seeking sleep or seeking knowledge or some combination of the two, I hope you have found something of value here. I hope your breathing has slowed and your thoughts have quieted. I hope the tensions of the day have loosened their grip. I hope you feel that particular satisfaction that comes from learning, from spending time with ideas and stories that expand understanding and create connection across time and space. Picture, if you will, the garden at Ryonji Temple in Kyoto, that famous arrangement of 15 rocks in raked white gravel, a composition created sometime during the Edo period by someone whose name has been lost to history. Imagine standing on the wooden veranda of the temple looking out at that simple pattern of stones and sand. The autumn afternoon quiet except for the sound of wind in the surrounding trees, the raked patterns perfect and temporary, certain to be disturbed by wind and rain, and remade tomorrow, the rock sitting silent and permanent, witnesses to centuries of contemplation. Imagine the generations of monks and visitors who have sat in that same spot, looking at that same arrangement, each finding their own meaning in the empty space and balanced stones, each bringing their own questions and leaving with their own answers, and imagine yourself part of that long chain of attention and appreciation, connected across time to all the others who have paused to notice beauty, and to contemplate impermanence, and to find peace in simplicity. In the end, perhaps that is what the Edo period offers us, a reminder that human beings can create meaning and beauty even within constraints, that limitation can sometimes foster rather than prevent creativity, that there is value in taking time to perfect practices and traditions, that peace, when it can be achieved and maintained, allows for the development of culture and the refinement of arts in ways that constant conflict prevents, and that the choices societies make about how to organize themselves, about what to preserve and what to change, about how to balance tradition and innovation, stability and growth, autonomy and engagement. These choices matter profoundly and shape the lives of everyone who must live within the systems those choices create. Sleep well, and if sleep does not come yet, let that be all right too. Let yourself rest in whatever state you find yourself. Let the story settle. Let the images and ideas drift and recombine in your thoughts as you relax into comfort and warmth. Dream if you dream of raked gardens and cherry blossoms falling, of tea ceremonies and quiet rooms, of ukiyo-e prints showing actors frozen in dramatic poses, of festivals and seasons turning slowly through the years, of a peace that lasted 2.5 centuries, of a world that chose isolation and created remarkable beauty in that chosen separation. Good night. Thank you for this time we have shared, for your attention and your interest, for travelling with me through the Edo period from its violent beginning to its transformative end. May you rest well. May you find peace. May you carry with you some small fragment of what we've explored together. Good night.